This podcast is sponsored by Boveda Humidity Packs. Boveda packs are meant to be stored with your cannabis flower. This helps control the relative humidity inside your jar, which is going to control the cannabinoid and terpene profile of your flower over time, so you'll never have to experience dry, crusty nugs. You may have seen Boveda packs in the weed bags you buy from the dispensary with your flower, but you can also purchase these for your home use. I highly encourage that you do, especially if you buy your flower in bulk. The packs come in a variety of sizes depending on how much bud you have at home. They are incredibly useful and affordable, and I noticed a huge difference when I started using these, and now I could never go back. I also want to note that every single Boveda employee that I have spoken with has been incredibly happy working at this company, and I have so much respect for them for being an ethical employer and helping fund education like this podcast. If you want to purchase some Boveda packs, the links will be available in the show notes of this episode. All right, welcome back to the Bioactive podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Riley Kirk. Today it's going to be kind of an impromptu episode on cannabis and anxiety. We are absolutely going to have some future episodes talking about anxiety and using other herbs like ashwagandha and these other natural products that you can use to help with your anxiety. But this one specifically is going to focus on cannabis and anxiety. Sometimes I think there's a misconception about cannabis that it just chills everyone out and it's always just going to be a good time. But for a lot of people, it can be really uncomfortable and it can actually cause a higher level of anxiety. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the science behind why that is the case for so many people, and the information hopefully is going to help you use cannabis in a more intentional way to help with your anxiety and to help avoid any anxiety causing events with cannabis. First and foremost, if there is anything that you take away from this episode, it should be that dose absolutely matters when we're talking about cannabis and anxiety. You can't just say that THC helps with anxiety. You can't just say CBD helps with anxiety. It's really all about what that effective dose is. And we're going to really talk about how to find that dose. So cannabinoids like THC or CBD, they exert what we call a biphasic response in the body. So bi means two and phasic means phases. So what that really means, at low doses, they make us feel one way, but at high doses, they make us feel a completely different way. So THC is probably the best example here because at low doses, it absolutely can help get rid of anxiety. And we call this anxiolytic response. It helps get rid of anxiety. But at higher levels, THC at larger doses can actually cause anxiety. And we call this an anxiogenic response. So it's actually generating anxiety, which of course nobody wants. So let's try to avoid that at all costs. Now, many of us have personal stories that would validate this, right? Personally, if I take an edible that is 5 milligrams or less, that definitely helps get rid of anxiety. I feel way less stress. I'm not going to have that oh my God, the world's caving in me response. But if I take anything more than, let's say, 10 milligrams, I get very paranoid, very anxious. It's very difficult for me to be in a social situation with more than 10 milligrams of THC in my system. Again, this could always be different for you depending on what your baseline tolerance is. If you're super new to cannabis, that low dose of THC might not be 5 milligrams or even 2.5 milligrams. It could be as low as 0.5 milligrams or 0.25 milligrams. So it's just something to keep in mind. Always start low. We're always trying to look for that minimum dose to get to the response that we're looking for. This biphasic response has also been validated in animal models, but there are some pretty pronounced differences between animal models and human models. It's not just that it's like a rodent versus a human, there's also a lot of environmental changes that we need to keep in mind. So with animal models, it's a very controlled setting in a laboratory. And for humans, we have our entire lives encapsulating us. We have a lot of different things going on in our own life, our personal life, our work life. We have different environments. When we're using cannabis, we're not usually in control settings. Sometimes we're at home and we're comfortable, but sometimes we're out in public. Sometimes we're at a friend's house. Sometimes we're at a house that we've never been to before. And these are really, really important things to keep in mind. So this is really where set and setting come into play. Oftentimes when we think about set and setting, we're really focused on psychedelics and less on cannabis. But I would say it's just as important with cannabis, especially if you're new to cannabis and you're still really understanding what response cannabis provokes in your body. It's also important to know if you're somebody who's already baseline anxiety is pretty high, this is, something you need to be hyper aware of and very mindful. If you're in a new place, you may actually feel more high and you might feel more anxious and paranoid compared to a place that you're really comfortable being around. So if you're new to cannabis, I would highly suggest starting to use cannabis in an environment that you're very comfortable with and with people you're very comfortable with, not, strangers in a public environment where you might feel super overwhelmed and just overall like really anxious apart from the THC. Now, when we talk about CBD, it has also been shown to exhibit that biphasic response in animal models and actually in 2 human trials as well. In one human trial, we discussed this actually earlier when we had Kyle Jones on the Bioactive podcast, where he was talking about the effective dose of CBD really being in the hundreds of milligrams and how most people taking CBD are taking like 10 to 20 milligrams and they might not find that it's working for them because they're really not taking the right dose. So these researchers used a simulated public speaking test model for anxiety. And in this study that we'll cite in the show notes here, there was 57 male volunteers, all male, so there was no females, and they found that pre-treatment with 300 milligrams of CBD had significant reductions in anxiety compared to the placebo. Now, the other doses in the study were 150 milligrams, 600 milligrams, and there was no significant response seen here. So it was really in that mid-range at 300 milligrams where the best response was seen. Now, similarly, in the other human trial we're talking about here, this was a real public speaking environment, and it involved both male and female sexes. Again, 300 milligrams was the effective dose, while the other doses, which were 100 and 900 milligrams of CBD, were not effective. So what's important to note here is, one, yes, most doses that people are taking are way below the dose that was seen to be effective in these studies. But also, if you go too high, it's also not effective. So that 650 milligrams in that first study and that 900 milligrams in that second study were not shown to be effective. So I think a lot of times with natural products or just with life in general, everyone's like, more is better. And that is not the case. When we think about cannabis, we do need to think about it how we would think about other medicines. The dose matters. It's not a guessing game. Now, I mentioned this when we were in the conversation with Kyle as well, but you don't need to just start with 300 milligrams. I think anytime you're starting something, anytime you're getting off of something, you should really take it in a stepwise manner. So starting with 100 milligrams and then maybe going to 200 and then 300 and seeing if that causes the response that you're looking for. Now, here's what we don't know, and it's something that people have been experimenting with for a long time. And that's what is the ideal combination of THC with CBD and what's best for anxiety? Now, of course, I'm just going to keep reiterating this. All of us are different. We have different social situations. We have different thresholds. We have different brains. So I'm not going to just throw out a number that's going to work for you. It might take a little bit of self-experimentation. But, what I would start with if I was someone who is brand new to cannabis is starting as low as a half of a milligram of THC and 100 milligrams of CBD. I would consider this microdosing THC. You could use this dose during the day. You're really not trying to feel high from it, but you are trying to have that activity in your brain that can help you feel less anxious. So this is a dose that I think a lot of people could still effectively go to work. They could drive. They could, really live their normal day life. They probably won't feel high at all. Again, if you're super sensitive to THC, this might be different for you. For somebody who's a little more seasoned with cannabis and cannabinoids, I would recommend maybe a starting dose at like 2.5 milligrams of THC and maybe 200 milligrams of CBD. And then again, if that's not enough, you could go to 5 milligrams of THC, 300 milligrams of CBD. But you're always really looking for that minimum therapeutic dose to get the results you're looking for. Because remember, you do build a tolerance to cannabinoids, specifically THC. So you really want to keep it as low as possible so you can stay at that level as long as possible and not feel overwhelmed. Remember that CBD is non-intoxicating, so you can take it a lot more compared to THC. You also may have a different dosing regimen for the daytime versus the nighttime. Now, I make a lot of products for myself and for some of my friends and family, and I always have different products for daytime and nighttime. So again, you could take a very, very, very low microdose of THC during the daytime combined with your CBD. And then at nighttime, you could have a higher dose of THC and a higher dose of CBD as well. It's also important to note, just for sleep, there's a huge association with comorbidity of anxiety and depression and sleep disorders. So using THC, using CBN, using these different compounds, CBD, can really improve your sleep and your anxiety if used in the right dosing. Now, it's pretty easy to measure out these doses when taking edibles. But let's talk about other consumption methods like smoking, because it can be a little more nuanced when we're really learning how much product to take and at what times of day, what strains to use, what types of cannabis to use. So smoking can specifically cause pretty bad bouts of anxiety for a lot of people because it activates your brain so quickly. It can really it can be overwhelming because it almost feels like, a truck hit you like immediately. You go from not feeling high to feeling overwhelmingly high in just a few minutes. And that's why a lot of people do use edibles, because it's a slower onset and it lasts longer. Whereas smoking and vaping is a much faster onset and it doesn't last as long. But it can be helpful for people who like to titrate their dose, meaning take little tiny bits or take a puff, only hit their vape once in a while, and this helps you kind of really build up to your desired level. So with smoking and vaping, you're really going to feel those peak effects from cannabis within about 7 minutes after smoking. And again, this is in comparison to edibles where it might take up to 2 hours to feel the peak effects. Now, this is great if you have a medical condition where you need relief instantaneously, but it also can feel overwhelming. If you're someone with baseline anxiety and a low tolerance to THC, smoking and vaping may not be the method that you choose to consume. But again, you might need to do a little bit of trial and error to figure out what works best for you. I also want to note here that although this might be true for some people, many other people just prefer smoking over other consumption methods like edibles because it is distinctively different. We know unique chemistry is produced during the smoking process that's not produced when you're eating edibles. It's a much more chemically diverse product to consume when you're smoking compared to if you're taking edibles. So myself and so many people still prefer smoking over other consumption methods, because it really does feel different, and there are advantages, especially when you build up a tolerance and you get a little more comfortable with cannabis. I also want to note, you don't have to take these kind of microdoses for cannabis. For some people, a 20 milligram edible might be their dose that helps with their anxiety, or maybe smoking a full joint, or maybe smoking 2 full joints. Again, we're all different. I'm just kind of sharing what has helped me and what has helped a lot of people that I know who suffer with anxiety. If smoking or vaping is your preferred consumption method, there are ways to change up your products and adjust your methods to be more conducive to anxiety. First, what we talk about all the time, and what we're going to continue to talk about all the time, is incorporating hemp flower. Now, just as a reminder, hemp flower is the same exact plant as the THC dominant flower that you buy at a dispensary. The main difference is it really doesn't contain significant levels of THC. Legally, it has to be below 0.3% THC. But it does contain significant levels of other cannabinoids like CBD or CBG, which is cannabigerol. So if you're someone who just loves smoking joints, you love rolling up, you love the intention, you love that process of rolling up, going for a walk and smoking outside, which I totally understand. And if you're someone who's also very, very anxious, I would recommend starting with a 1-to-10 ratio of THC flower, like what you'd buy at a dispensary, and hemp flower, which you can purchase online. Now, if you're like, oh, I don't feel anything from this really wasn't a positive experience, like I'm trying to feel a little bit more than this, then maybe go to a 1-to-5 ratio, or even a 1-to-1 ratio, which is my happy spot, 1-to-1 of THC cannabis to CBD dominant cannabis. Now, smoking joints isn't always the best consumption method for people because, again, we feel compelled to finish that entire joint, right? We're not going to roll up an entire joint and just take one puff of it and put it out, because we'd be wasting a lot of flower over time. So it can be easier to just, take a hit of a bong or a bowl, and that can kind of help not feeling overwhelmed because we're not taking as much. We don't feel compelled to finish that entire bowl. You can just take a corner hit of a bowl and just walk away after that. So that can be kind of a little hack if you're somebody who, like me, if I light up a joint, I'm probably going to finish the whole thing. And that's why I recommend mixing in that CBD flower, because you can finish the entire joint if that's the consumption method you prefer. And remember that cannabis hits differently at different times of the day. Now, if we're someone who loves a good wake and bake, you might have noticed that you feel really, really, really high first thing in the morning if you smoke. And the whole rationale behind that is because you have these cannabinoid receptors in your brain, but you also have the molecules your body's making that interact with those receptors. So in the morning, your levels of endocannabinoids are really, really low. So there's really nothing to compete with the THC for that space in that receptor. So all that THC is binding to that receptor, and you're going to feel pretty high. Whereas later in the day, when your body's producing more of these endocannabinoids, it's going to be competing with the THC for that receptor space. So you're not going to feel as overwhelmingly high. So if you have baseline anxiety, I would not suggest using high THC products in the morning, but you may react better to them later in the afternoon and into the evening. But this is also important because, you definitely should be recording what products you're taking, how much you're taking, and what time of the day that you're taking these products, just as you're learning how to use cannabis and what products work good for you. So make sure you're recording, at 8 a.m. I took a hit of this and I felt way too overwhelmingly high. So then the next day, maybe you waited till noon, you took that same hit and you felt significantly more comfortable and way less anxious. Now, every time that I talk about anxiety online, there's always people saying to just smoke more weed and you won't get anxiety. And although this is sometimes a little bit annoying to get these messages, there's actually some truth behind it. And let's talk about the science, because I'm not just going to tell everyone to, smoke as much weed as possible and your anxiety is going to go away, but there is some scientific rationale behind this. So when you start using cannabis, you're super new to it, you have the most amount of cannabinoid receptors in your brain, right? You're totally new to cannabis. You have a lot of cannabinoid receptors. And specifically here, we're talking about the cannabinoid 1 receptor, the one that THC binds to. As you continue to use cannabis and you continue to build up that tolerance to THC, you might notice that it takes more and more THC to get those same effects from that cannabis flower, or more and more cannabis in general to feel those effects. And that's because your body's actually removing some of those cannabinoid receptors from your brain. And it really is like a protective mechanism. It's essentially saying, okay, well, you keep activating all of these receptors, so clearly we don't need all of these. So I'm just going to remove some of those receptors. And there's different methods of actually developing tolerance. We'll get into that in a future episode because that's kind of like nitty-gritty science that I'm sure not everyone wants to get into right now. But the main point here is that your body is removing some of those cannabinoid 1 receptors from your brain. So what that means is you have less receptors for that THC to bind to, so you're not going to feel those effects as strongly. Now, if the reason we feel high is THC acting on these receptors, and if you have the most receptors as your tolerance is the lowest, this means that you're going to have the heaviest hitting, most intense high when you're pretty naive to cannabis. As you develop tolerance and as you have less receptors, you have a less intense high. It's important to note here, you're also getting used to the feeling of being high, and you're getting more comfortable with the feeling of activating those receptors and what THC does to your body. But essentially, that anxiety can be really, really, really intense when you're still relatively new to cannabis because you're not used to the feeling and you have a ton of cannabinoid receptors in your brain for the THC to bind to and initiate the effects. So yeah, in theory, building some level of tolerance could be a protective mechanism to not feel too anxious or overwhelmed from THC. Now, obviously, this method is not for everyone. I'm not telling everyone to go out and smoke, 5 joints a day to try to get your tolerance up, but it's something that you may notice over time that you do feel less anxious, you do feel less overwhelmed, and you do feel more comfortable because you've started to build that tolerance to THC. Okay, so now we've discussed CBD, we've discussed THC, we've discussed the importance of setting and dose and tolerance. So let's talk about terpenes, because terpenes are another important factor to consider. As a reminder, terpenes are these smelly compounds in cannabis that give each strain that unique smell. But terpenes also are bioactive. They cause effects in our body, and they can change the way we feel from consuming cannabis. The terpene profile is a huge part of the reason why some strains are uplifting and other strains are sedating, aka that classic indica sativa effects that we always talk about. So it's really important when you're buying new flower or you're picking up flower from a grower to know what terpenes are present so that you can document how those terpenes made you feel and if you liked the effects or if you didn't like the effects from those terpenes. Now, sometimes when I label terpenes and I kind of talk about terpenes, it can sound like a foreign language. So don't get overwhelmed, but I am going to mention some different compounds. So some terpenes have been shown to help with anxiety. And these are mainly linalool, which is that beautiful lavender smell that you get from some cannabis strains, but also that linalool is dominant in lavender. So if you can't find strains that have a significant amount of linalool, you can always add a little bit of lavender flower in with your joints or in with whatever consumption method that you're using. Side note here, just make sure you're buying quality lavender that doesn't have any pesticides or herbicides on it, because a lot of lavender isn't meant necessarily for smoking. So we want to make sure that we're not putting any negative products into our body that we don't want in our body. Now, another terpene is called beta-caryophyllene. Beta-caryophyllene is found in peppers. It's in cloves. It's that very earthy smell. I love the smell of caryophyllene. I'm always kind of drawn to those earthy smells. There's also humulene, which has been shown to help with anxiety, both anecdotally and from a few studies. Humulene is found in hops, which is one of the plants that's most closely related to cannabis and obviously also found in a lot of cannabis varieties. And then there's also ocimene. Ocimene is not always super abundant in cannabis strains, but it can be one of the minor terpenes that could play a significant role in how you feel. Now, these are the terpenes that we would be, looking for to help with our anxiety, to be anxiolytic, to help get rid of some of that anxiety. But there's also some terpenes that have shown to be anxiogenic, right? That could help generate anxiety. And these are the ones we kind of want to stay away from. The two terpenes that I think we have the most data for actually causing anxiety are limonene and terpenylene. And these two terpenes are common in sativa type strains. Now, the indica sativa classification isn't necessarily the most accurate all the time, scientifically speaking, but you do find significant amounts of limonene and terpenylene in these classic sativas, so it's something to look out for. Limonene smells like citrusy type things, and terpenylene's kind of this interesting smell where it's almost like a conglomerate of a bunch of different smells, but I think it kind of does have those citrusy undertones as well. Now, we don't have a ton of clinical data on terpenes. Let's be completely honest about that. A lot of the information that I'm speaking about comes from anecdotal evidence from cannabis users, which I think personally is completely legitimate data. I think we'll see more and more clinical data being generated in the upcoming years as cannabis gets more personalized and more refined, more scientific, and more medicinal. So how do we use this information on terpenes to look for products, right? These words are great and all, but what do I look for when I go to a dispensary? Well, first, if you buy your weed at a dispensary, you can look at the menu ahead of time online by Googling the dispensary and looking at their menu. And many times these dispensaries will have some sort of labeling system. Maybe they'll just label the top 3 terpenes in each of the strains and also the THC and CBD percentages. So you can look for, a moderate level of THC. If you can find it like 15 to 20%, that's a pretty moderate level for this day and age for THC. You want to look for also having CBD present if you can. And if you can't, of course, add in that hemp flower and then look for these terpenes when it's labeling those top 3 terpenes. You're looking for linalool, caryophyllene, humulene, and ocimene as part of these top 3 terpenes. Now, not every dispensary is going to label those, of course. So if you go into the dispensary, maybe you can ask your bud tender to help you find strains that are dominant in those terpenes. Any bud tenders that are listening to this podcast, mentally in your head, if you could have one strain in mind, one pre-roll in mind that you could help recommend to the people coming in to your dispensary that are dominant in these terpenes, moderate THC, that would be incredibly helpful for so many consumers. Now, if your dispensary only lists flower as indica, sativa, or hybrid, personally, if I had anxiety, I would really lean towards those indica type varieties. Again, this indica sativa hybrid isn't super backed by science, but in general, we're kind of trying to stay away from the terpenes that are really dominant in your classic sativas. So just going for a indica could just be better than just blindly picking a strain. Because, indicas in general are meant to be more sedating and relaxing, and that may be the case and help you with anxiety. If you are lucky enough to have a dispensary where you can smell the different strains, those different varieties, we always talk about in cannabis the nose knows. So you're really smelling these different varieties, and I would really smell and look for those like earthy tones, because that's typically what these terpenes smell like that have shown to be anxiolytic. So really looking for those earthy smells, and also, what smell really resonates with you. I mean, we have not fully elucidated why smelling certain strains, why we can kind of know how smelling a certain strain is going to make us feel. But a lot of people, including myself, are fully behind this notion, and I think it's worth a try at the very least. Now, if you want to use this information and you want to look for what strains are going to be most helpful for you, I did upload a complete guide to cannabis and anxiety, including some strain recommendations on my Patreon, which you can sign up for as little as $1 a month, which is just $12 a year. And that also really condenses all the information from this podcast into a really simplified flyer that you could also bring to a dispensary and use that as a guide when you're there. If the strain recommendations that I have on that flyer are not available near you, you can use websites like Weed Maps to find similar strains, and you can also use these websites to find strains that are dominant in the terpenes that we have talked about. I hope this information has been helpful for you. I know a lot of people struggle with cannabis and anxiety, myself included. I've had some, bouts of anxiety using cannabis. And another thing I would recommend is, sometimes anxiety can be a good thing. Obviously, not always. We don't want to be chronically anxious. But sometimes if you can kind of lean into that anxiety, if your body's telling you, hey, you're anxious because you haven't finished this, or you haven't, responded to this email or whatever, sometimes kind of leaning into that anxiety and actually completing some of the tasks that your brain is telling you to complete can be helpful. But I think these tips can be a really good way to kind of guide you in the right direction with finding the right cannabis products and strains to help with your anxiety. My biggest takeaway, though, is that dose matters. Start low and go slow. And then if you have any follow-up questions, please just comment on the YouTube video if you're watching on YouTube, or you can also leave any comments and message me on Patreon, and I will get back to you. So thank you again so much for listening to the Bioactive podcast. We will be back next week with a special guest to talk about some really cool psychedelic science.